innocent apple orchard, until the night it turned fatal. Welcome to Echo Files. I am your host, Walter Finch. Comment below. Where are you listening from tonight? Your voices make this storytelling magical. Now, let's step into the mystery. The village of St. Aldwyn's, nestled among rolling English meadows and stitched together by ancient stone lanes, was a place where time seemed to move at a gentler pace. In spring, apple blossoms cast soft petals over the cottage rooftops. In summer, the air was honeyed with the scent of roses from Mrs. Penberry's overzealous garden. And by autumn, the leaves burned gold and copper before floating down onto the quiet streets. It was the sort of place where nothing ever happened, or at least nothing that wasn't whispered over the hedge or over teacups at the local inn. That afternoon, the village had gathered at Fallen Lord's, the ancestral estate that had once belonged to the late Viscount Edrington. The name, romantic and faintly ominous, referred not to scandal, but to the old orchard at the edge of the property, where generations of Edringtons had planted rows of apple trees that had since bowed with age. Now, the estate belonged to Mrs. Isabel Harcourt, a distant cousin of the family and a woman who had turned the crumbling manor into a sort of social curiosity. Her garden teas were renowned, not for their refinement, but for the frank amusement of observing who might appear and who might leave in a huff. "Ah, Miss Marple," Isabel called out brightly as a modest figure in a pale lavender cardigan made her way across the gravel path. "We were just wondering if you'd manage the hill." Miss Marple smiled with the faintest twinkle, leaning slightly on her walking stick. "Oh, the hill is nothing at all," she said, though she allowed herself a small rest as she surveyed the gathering. Her blue eyes, sharp as ever despite her years, took in the little tableau. Dr. Lionel Fenwick, the village physician, gesturing with too much animation toward the vicar's wife. Lucy Penberry, cheeks pink and a ribbon askew, whispering fiercely to her younger brother. And Mr. Henry Cotterill, the solicitor, standing stiffly apart as though he might catch something dreadful if he engaged in idle conversation. The air smelled faintly of warm cider and cut grass. A table had been laid out under the sprawling chestnut tree, laden with sponge cakes, cucumber sandwiches, and a bowl of apples gleaming like polished rubies. There was the gentle clatter of teacups, the occasional shriek of a child chasing another around the lawn, and the low hum of bees. It was all so very ordinary, at least until Lucy Penberry screamed. It was a high, piercing sound, the sort that made everyone freeze mid-sentence. Miss Marple's head turned toward the orchard instinctively. Through the neat gap in the hedgerow, she saw Lucy standing at the edge of the apple rows, her hand clapped over her mouth. Her brother came pounding across the grass, and in a moment, several of the adults were hurrying after him. Miss Marple, with a patience that belied her years, made her way forward. She did not hurry. She had learned long ago that haste rarely served anyone well. The orchard was quiet, except for the whisper of wind through the branches. Sunlight dappled the ground in restless patterns, making it almost difficult to see, until the figure became clear. A man lay among the fallen apples. His tweed jacket was rumpled, and one arm was thrown out at an unnatural angle. A few leaves clung to his hair, and a dark bruise was already blooming along the side of his temple. "Good heavens," Dr. Fenwick muttered, kneeling. He pressed 2 fingers to the man's neck, his lips tightening. "He's dead." "Who is it?" Mrs. Harcourt demanded, flustered and pale. Henry Cotterill cleared his throat. "That's Mr. Archibald Sims, isn't it? The chap who rents the old miller's cottage?" Yes, said someone from the back. Kept to himself. Very quiet fellow. though I heard he was once some sort of banker in London." As they spoke, Miss Marple's gaze wandered. The scene seemed to arrange itself like a puzzle waiting to be solved. The scattered apples, the neat rows of trees, the man's hat lying a good 3 feet from his head. She noticed, too, the tiny details others overlooked. The way one branch above was cracked but not quite broken. The faint scuff on the toe of the man's right shoe. The fact that there were no apples on the ground immediately around him, except for those freshly fallen and bruised. "Poor man," she said softly, folding her hands. "I wonder how he came to be here." "Fell," Dr. Fenwick said briskly. "Must have fallen from the ladder. He was likely picking apples. Simple as that." Murmured Miss Marple. "Perhaps." But her eyes lingered on the ladder leaning neatly against a nearby tree. It did not look as though it had been knocked over in any struggle. In fact, it was standing quite straight, too far from the body for a natural fall. Behind her, the villagers began to murmur in the familiar, nervous rhythm of gossip. Already stories were forming like mist on the orchard grass. "Strange man, that one. I heard he had debts." "Debts?" No, he was after Lucy, you know. Always finding excuses to walk past the Penberry's gate." Miss Marple said nothing. She only glanced once more at the ladder, the hat, and the neat row of trees with their heavy, glinting fruit. Somewhere in that quiet orchard lay the first whisper of truth, though everyone else seemed content to call it an accident. She had lived too long and seen too many tragedies dressed as misfortunes to believe in such convenient explanations. The orchard slowly emptied as Dr. Fenwick, after much fussing and muttering, declared that the constable would need to be summoned. Villagers drifted back to the lawn, drawn by equal parts fear and curiosity, while Mrs. Harcourt wrung her hands and fretted over her tarnished social afternoon. Lucy Penberry clung to her brother, still pale as milk, and whispered frantically into his ear. Henry Cotterell had gone very stiff and officious, as if the weight of the law had fallen upon his shoulders in the absence of any real authority. Miss Marple, however, lingered in the orchard a moment longer, her steps soft on the grass. She watched the way the dappled sunlight shifted over the lifeless figure of Archibald Sims. He had not been a man well known or well liked, which was to say, he'd been politely tolerated as a curiosity, a newcomer who preferred the shade of his cottage to the bustle of village life. Still, in St. Aldwyn's, no one ever truly went unnoticed. There were always whispers. He received letters with a London postmark. He took long, solitary walks to the river. He had once been seen speaking heatedly to a man in a gray overcoat who never came again. When Miss Marple finally followed the others, she found them clustered near the tea table, voices low and taut with excitement. The sight was all too familiar. Grief and shock seldom lingered long in such settings. Speculation was the more natural impulse. "Terrible, just terrible," Mrs. Harcourt was saying, pressing a lace handkerchief to her lips. "To think, on my own lawn, or nearly so. It could ruin one's reputation for hospitality. What will the county say?" "Rubbish, Isabel," said Henry Cotterell sharply. "A man has died. That is the only concern. And I suppose," he added with a lawyer's sense of propriety, "that until the constable arrives, we are all witnesses of a sort." "That's all very well," sniffed Mrs. Harcourt. "But why on earth was he in the orchard at all?" "He had no business there. None." Lucy, who had been biting her lip hard enough to leave a mark, suddenly spoke. "He used to come by the orchard sometimes. I saw him once last week, walking between the trees. He seemed to be looking for something." Miss Marple, seated now with a demure cup of tea, glanced up at the girl with a mild expression. Looking for something, my dear? That's rather interesting. Did he find it, do you suppose? Lucy shook her head. I don't know. I didn't stay to watch. He was, I don't know. Strange. Strange, prompted Henry Cotterill, leaning forward. Lucy hesitated. Not frightening exactly, but he always seemed to be listening for something, or someone, like he expected someone to meet him there. There was a pause, filled only by the buzzing of a late wasp over the jam tarts. Then the familiar rhythm of village chatter began again, this time laced with sharper undercurrents. Perhaps he had an enemy, muttered Dr. Fenwick, who seemed reluctant to leave the excitement for his surgery. There's talk he left London under a cloud. Debts, maybe. Or worse. Debts. Mrs. Harcourt latched onto the "your" word as though it explained everything. I knew there was something unsavory about him. That sort of man always brings trouble. Miss Marple stirred her tea, her eyes lowered. Trouble rarely arrived in quite the way people expected, she thought. She had observed enough human nature to know that the appearance of scandal was often a mask for something quieter and more dangerous. By the time Constable Reeves arrived, red-faced, a little winded from his bicycle, the narrative of the village had already begun to take shape. The poor man had fallen from a ladder, or he had been drinking, or perhaps he had met some shadowy enemy from his London past. Reeves listened, nodding solemnly as he followed Dr. Fenwick to the orchard. Miss Marple walked with them, her knitting bag over one arm as though she had merely wandered into an idle afternoon. She watched the constable frown at the ladder, scratch his head at the body, and finally turn to the doctor. Looks like an accident to me, he said. Bumped his head in the fall. Shame, that. Dr. Fenwick agreed readily enough, though his eyes flickered once toward Miss Marple, as if to check whether she shared his opinion. She gave him a polite, non-committal smile. You're certain he fell? She asked gently. Well, yes. Must have. What else could it be? Oh, I cannot say, Miss Marple replied. Only it is curious, is it not, that he should have left his hat so far from where he lies? And the ladder. Quite upright still, almost as if no one had used it at all. The constable shuffled his feet. I'll make a note of that, Miss Marple. The body was taken to the doctor's surgery to await the coroner, and the villagers began their slow dispersal, leaving behind crumbs of sponge cake and the residue of fear. Children were hushed, doors were bolted early, and curtains twitched as shadows lengthened over the green. That evening, St. Aldwyn's hummed with the quiet electricity of gossip. In the snug of the Red Hart Inn, 3 farmers debated whether the London man had been after Lucy Penberry, while in the vicarage kitchen, Mrs. Weatherby insisted to anyone who would listen that she had seen him once slip something shiny into his coat pocket by the river. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat by her window at the edge of the village, the soft clicking of knitting needles punctuating her thoughts. A simple accident might satisfy the constable, but she had long ago learned that people often dressed malice in the clothing of misfortune. And there were little details that would not leave her mind. The upright ladder, the fallen hat, the man who walked the orchard as if waiting for someone, and the hush in Lucy Penberry's voice when she said he was strange. She glanced toward the orchard in the fading light, its rows of apple trees darkening against the sky. Somewhere there, in the rustle of branches and the memory of a single scream, lay the beginning of a story no one yet dared to speak aloud. And Miss Marple, serene in her chair, knew that human nature, predictable as the seasons, would soon provide the rest. Evening descended upon St. Aldwyn's with a hush that seemed almost reverential, though the stillness was deceptive. Behind the drawn curtains and softly lit windows, The village was alive with whispers. What had begun as an afternoon tea had become, by nightfall, the subject of fevered speculation. A man dead in the orchard was more than an unfortunate event. It was an invitation for suspicion, and the people of St. Aldwyn's, despite their quiet manners, were never ones to turn away such an invitation. Miss Marple had gone home in the early evening, offering polite condolences to Mrs. Harcourt and a few gentle words to the still trembling Lucy Penberry. By the time she had set her kettle to boil and settled into her armchair with her knitting, she already knew how the next few days in the village would unfold. She had seen it all before. A stone cast into a pond always created ripples, and in a place as small and self-contained as St. Aldwyn's, those ripples could become waves. The first ripple came from Mrs. Martha Cribb, the postmistress and self-appointed custodian of the village's moral ledger. That evening, as she closed the little post office, she recounted to the baker's wife how she had noticed just last Thursday a letter addressed to Mr. Archibald Sims bearing the return of some quite grand London chambers. "Financial solicitors, I'm certain of it," she whispered, eyes glittering with purpose. "And only the desperate or the wicked have dealings with them." By the following morning, this scrap of information had grown into the first consensus. Archibald Sims was a man with debts, and debts, in the polite arithmetic of village gossip, always equaled trouble. Miss Marple, however, took in these rumors as she might the flickers of light on the river. Interesting, but not necessarily illuminating. She spent the morning walking to the greengrocer's for a small bag of carrots she did not need, and then to the churchyard, where she paused to admire the roses and happen upon Mrs. Penberry, who was gathering flowers for the altar. "My dear," Miss Marple said kindly, "your Lucy had quite a shock yesterday." "I do hope she slept." Mrs. Penberry, a sharp-nosed woman whose nerves were perpetually strung taut, gave a tight little laugh. "Not a wink, I shouldn't think. She's always been delicate, my Lucy, easily startled." Her tone wavered, revealing more than she intended. "I do hope people won't start saying things. You know how they are, Miss Marple." "Yes, people do tend to say things," Miss Marple agreed mildly, clicking her tongue as though lamenting the ways of the world. "Though I should think Lucy had nothing to fear. She simply happened to be in the orchard first, that is all." Mrs. Penberry's eyes darted away. "Well, she never liked that man. He was always lurking about." Miss Marple tilted her head, feigning curiosity. "Lurking? How odd. And yet, if he wished to court your Lucy, one might expect flowers, perhaps, or a polite call." Mrs. Penberry's lips pressed together in disapproval, though her silence spoke volumes. There had been no flowers, no polite call, only the sense of being watched. By the time Miss Marple returned to her cottage, she had pieced together the outlines of a social web. Lucy, skittish and possibly holding something back. Archibald Sims, solitary but perhaps not as aimless as he appeared. Mrs. Penberry, anxious to distance her daughter from any hint of impropriety. And Mrs. Cribb, who would spread the notion of debts with evangelical zeal. The second ripple came that afternoon, when Constable Reeves called upon Miss Marple with the air of a man seeking reassurance. "Just wanted to let you know, ma'am, the coroner's having a look," he said, shuffling his cap between his hands. "Doctor, Fenwick's written it up as an accidental death, though he says he can't rule out a knock on the head from the fall." Miss Marple offered him a plate of currant biscuits, which he accepted gratefully. "So it is all quite settled, then?" she asked, her voice soft and guileless. "Well," Reeves hesitated, clearly uneasy. "Thing is, some folks are saying the fellow had enemies, or debts." And now Mrs. Cribb's telling anyone who'll listen that a strange man came through on the Tuesday post. London sort. Miss Marple's needles clicked, the rhythm unbroken. People do love to embroider their stories, don't they, Constable? Though I wonder, if Mr. Sims truly feared someone, why go to the orchard? Reeves blinked. Maybe he liked apples? Perhaps, Miss Marple said with a tiny smile. Though it does seem odd, doesn't it? One would expect a fearful man to seek company, not solitude. By the next day, the third ripple had arrived. A memory, half forgotten, and now polished into significance by hindsight. Mr. Tom Bristow, the groundskeeper at Fallen Lords, ambled into the Red Hart Inn and declared that he had seen footprints in the orchard the evening before the death. 2 sets, I swear to it, he said, thumping the table for emphasis. One of 'em Mr. Sims, sure as eggs, and the other heavier, maybe. Boots. Boots? The innkeeper repeated, delighted. Who'd wear boots this weather? Unless... The implication hung in the smoky air, thick with imagination. Someone had met Archibald Sims in the orchard, someone in boots. Miss Marple heard of this the following morning while purchasing stamps. She only nodded thoughtfully and observed that boots could belong to anyone. And men do so often walk in the soft earth without meaning to leave a mystery behind. But in her mind, a quiet pattern was forming. A man waiting in an orchard, a second set of footprints, a death that was far too neat to be an accident. That afternoon, she paid a social call to Mrs. Harcourt, who had taken to reclining on a chaise longue with a shawl, milking her proximity to tragedy for all it was worth. My dear Miss Marple, she moaned, this house will never feel the same. Death beneath my trees. I keep thinking I shall look out the window and see him there, quite ghastly. Miss Marple sipped her tea and let the woman talk herself into a state of theatrical fragility. Only when the lamentations paused for breath did she interject, I wonder, my dear, did Mr. Sims know anyone in the village at all? Aside from the casual hellos, I mean. Mrs. Harcourt sniffed. Well, he came to my teas now and then, and I saw him speaking to that solicitor fellow, Cotterill, once or twice. Odd pair. I thought perhaps they were arranging a tenancy matter. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled almost imperceptibly. Cotterill again. A man who had been quick to declare the death a matter for the constable, quick to speak of debts, and now revealed as a quiet acquaintance of the deceased. In villages like St. Aldwyn's, acquaintances were rarely innocent of significance. As the day waned, Miss Marple took her usual slow walk past the orchard. The trees stood still, heavy with late fruit, and the grass beneath was undisturbed save for the faintest impression of recent footsteps, now softened by wind and time. She paused, observing the place where the ladder had stood. It was always the smallest details that mattered. The distance of a hat from a body, the angle of a scuff on a shoe, the quiet tension in a mother's denial. And somewhere among these small things lay the truth of how Archibald Sims came to lie dead among the apples. Miss Marple folded her hands over her knitting bag and smiled faintly into the evening light. Human nature, she reflected, had a way of revealing itself. All one needed was patience, and she had patience in abundance. The ripples in St. Aldwyn's were spreading, and soon they would collide. The next morning dawned pale and misty, a soft haze clinging to the hedgerows as though the village itself hesitated to wake. St. Aldwyn's had a way of magnifying the extraordinary. Here, a death in the orchard felt not only tragic, but almost sacrilegious, an intrusion into the unspoken covenant of rural peace. Miss Marple, peering from her cottage window as she poured hot water over her morning tea leaves, noted the telltale signs of the village stirring under the weight of intrigue. Mr. Bristow trudged past with his rake, his posture tall with the self-importance of a man who had become a key witness. 2 doors down, Mrs. Cribb stood in her garden, pruning roses that required no pruning, her sharp little eyes alert for passing confidences. By 10 o'clock, the first official visit had been made to Mr. Edgar Cotterill, the local solicitor. Constable Reeves, lacking the polish of a detective but full of earnest determination, had knocked politely and asked a series of questions that seemed to please Mr. Cotterill enormously. "Poor Sims," Cotterill said, with the solemnity of a man trying on gravitas. "I can't pretend we were close friends, but we'd spoken a few times on business. He was hoping to let out a small property he had in the next parish, and he was, well, cash-strapped, I suppose one might say." Reeves, whose imagination had been helpfully fertilized by Mrs. Cribb, nodded sagely. "And cash-strapped men can make enemies, sir." "Enemies?" Cotterill's eyebrows arched with dainty skepticism. "I hardly think, though, now you mention it, he did seem uneasy of late, yes, nervous. I had the distinct impression he feared some misfortune." Reeves, beaming at his own investigative skill, jotted this down and left, satisfied he had identified the first serious lead. Miss Marple heard the exchange not directly, but in the manner she always did, through the tapestry of village chatter. By the time she walked past the post office, Mrs. Cribb had already relayed the conversation to the vicar's wife, who was passing it along with slight embellishments about threats from London. Miss Marple made no comment, merely purchasing a packet of stationery she had no need for. Her pleasure was in listening, collecting these fragments like beads, knowing that when strung together, they would form a pattern invisible to those blinded by excitement. That afternoon, she called upon Mrs. Penbury and Lucy, under the guise of returning a borrowed gardening magazine. Lucy answered the door, her face wan and strained, and it struck Miss Marple that the girl's eyes were ringed as if she had slept little for 2 nights in a row. "My dear child," she said gently, "I do hope you've taken some broth and rest. A shock like that can linger dreadfully." Lucy murmured her thanks and led her into the small drawing room, where Mrs. Penbury sat rigid as an umbrella handle, her lips pursed as if she had been expecting judgment to knock alongside Miss Marple. "Such a dreadful business." Miss Marple sighed, settling into a chair with the ease of a woman who never appeared to intrude. "The village quite in a flurry. I expect the constable has been about?" Mrs. Penbury sniffed. "He has. Foolish man asked if Lucy had ever quarreled with Mr. Sims. As if my daughter—" Lucy flinched, just a flicker, but Miss Marple's keen eyes caught it. Quarreled. That single word had touched some buried nerve. Miss Marple let the silence sit a moment, filling it with the soft click of her knitting needles, which she had taken from her bag as naturally as a cat grooming itself in the sun. Then she said, in the tone of idle reminiscence, "I suppose Mr. Sims did keep to himself, though I sometimes saw him near your gate. Perhaps he admired the roses." Lucy's hands twisted in her lap. He might have," she said faintly. Mrs. Penbury interjected briskly, "He was a peculiar man. Odd notions. A proper suitor would have come through the front door and announced himself. My Lucy has no need of orchard loiterers." There it was again, the orchard. Miss Marple filed the phrasing away. Lucy had likely been the object of attention, perhaps unwanted. If Mr. Sims had approached her in a manner the village might frown upon, it would explain her nervousness and her mother's prickly defensiveness. When Miss Marple left, she paused at the gate, looking out toward the distant rise where Fallen Lord's orchard lay. She allowed herself a tiny, private smile. Human behavior was so often like a game of whist. Players gave away their hands without knowing they had done so. That evening, a new ripple stirred the pond. Tom Bristow, enjoying his newfound celebrity, had been drinking at the Red Hart again. With 2 pints in him, his story of the double footprints in the orchard became more vivid, more damning. "Boots, I tell you," he exclaimed to the small crowd. "And big ones, too. None of your Sunday shoes. Someone met Sims out there, and I'll wager he didn't leave him breathing." When asked who in the village wore such boots, Bristow grinned, savoring the power of suggestion. "Well, Mr. Cotterill does when he's off to the marshes. And there's young Bill Carter, always clomping about. But if you ask me—" He leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "It's that London fellow what's been sneaking about. The one posted that letter." By morning, the first solid suspect had crystallized in the village imagination. A shadowy London man with large boots and darker intentions. Constable Reeves, eager to please, told Miss Marple this theory as he delivered her a note about the coroner's inquest. "We'll have it solved soon enough, ma'am. Likely just some ruffian from the city with a grudge." Miss Marple's expression was mild. "Yes, that would be very convenient, wouldn't it?" "Convenient?" Reeves frowned. "Well," Miss Marple said, as if considering the knitting in her lap, "it would spare the village a dreadful business if we could blame someone far away. But life rarely is so obliging. People seldom get themselves killed for reasons that are distant. More often, it is a small matter, something quite near to home, that proves fatal." Reeves scratched his head, uneasy, and muttered something about keeping an eye on the post deliveries. By late afternoon, Miss Marple's attention had shifted to Mr. Cotterill, the polite and ever careful solicitor. She contrived to encounter him on the lane near the orchard, where he was walking with a folded umbrella despite the fair weather. "Such a sad business, Mr. Cotterill," she said, with her most guileless smile. "Quite so, Miss Marple. Tragic indeed. I only hope the authorities will see to it quickly. A scandal does nobody any good." "I dare say not," she agreed. "Though one does wonder what poor Mr. Sims was doing alone among the apples. I suppose he had some reason to expect company?" Cotterill's steps faltered just slightly, a hitch so brief another observer might have missed it. I couldn't say. Perhaps he enjoyed solitude. Or perhaps," Miss Marple said with soft musing, "he expected a conversation that required privacy." Cotterill inclined his head stiffly, offered a murmured farewell, and walked briskly toward the main road. Miss Marple watched him go, her pale blue eyes calm as summer sky. She had seen that look before, the faint tightening around the mouth, the sudden desire to be elsewhere. Guilt often showed itself not in words, but in the wish to escape them. That night, as the village settled under another uneasy dusk, the first true suspects had taken shape in Miss Marple's mind. There was Lucy, with her trembling nerves and unspoken history with the dead man. There was Mr. Cotterill, whose interest in privacy and haste to close the matter spoke louder than he knew. And beyond them, the faint outline of a London shadow, real or imagined, lurking in every whispered conversation. And through it all, the orchard stood silent under the moon, keeping its secrets. The following morning dawned with a crispness that seemed to bite through the usual tranquility of St. Aldwyn's. The orchard, with its drooping boughs heavy with autumn apples, had regained a deceptive serenity. Yet to Miss Marple, it whispered of secrets not yet yielded. By breakfast, the village had already thickened with gossip. The Red Hart's patrons had fueled the evening with speculation about boots, shadows, and whispered threats. Even the postmistress, who usually prided herself on a tone of disinterest, now handed out letters with the solemnity of a court crier, pausing for any remark that might betray the next clue in the unfolding drama. Miss Marple, after her porridge and weak tea, decided on a gentle stroll that would, coincidentally, lead her past the orchard once more. She carried with her a small basket, ostensibly for gathering rose hips for syrup. But in truth, her eyes were intent on the ground and the hedgerows, always seeking that which others, with their hurried feet and louder minds, missed. She approached the gate to Fallen Lord's orchard, noting the splintered latch where Constable Reeves had forced it during his initial examination. A light drizzle had fallen overnight, softening the soil just enough to preserve any new impressions. Miss Marple's eyes, as deceptively mild as a sky before a storm, studied the earth. There were the familiar double footprints, large and clumsy, the ones that Tom Bristow had made so much of in the Red Hart. But just beyond them, yes, there was something smaller. Not quite a shoe print, and not quite a bare foot, but a peculiar impression like the rounded heel of a slipper or perhaps a soft-soled house shoe. Most would have missed it in the churned mud. Miss Marple bent, feigning the stiffness of age, and examined it closer. She noted two things. The odd step pattern suggested hesitation. A person had crept, paused, and shifted their weight nervously. And there was the faintest smear of pale green wool fibers caught on a low bramble. She did not touch it. She had learned long ago that true detectives rarely needed to collect a thing. The knowledge of where it lay and what it implied was often enough. As she straightened, she became aware she was not alone. Lucy Penberry was standing several yards down the lane, her pale face half hidden under the brim of her hat. She carried no basket, no apparent reason for being there. "Oh, my dear," Miss Marple called gently. "Out for some air? It does one good, especially after a shock." Lucy hesitated, then walked slowly toward her, hands clasped tight before her. "Yes, I thought I'd see the orchard. I keep thinking about—" She stopped herself, lips trembling. "Perfectly natural," Miss Marple soothed. "One often feels compelled to revisit the scene of a tragedy. Sometimes the mind seeks to make sense of what it fears." Lucy glanced at the gate, and then down at the muddy verge, her shoes dainty and utterly unsuited to country lanes. Miss Marple, ever so mildly, asked, "Did you know Mr. Sims was fond of this path?" I suppose so. He passed sometimes." "You know," Miss Marple said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "people do say he had his eye on you." Lucy's face flooded with color, and for a moment, the girl looked like a trapped bird. He might have. But I never encouraged him. Mama would never... She stopped again, biting her lip, and Miss Marple saw the faintest tremor pass through her frame. The old lady only smiled kindly. "Oh, my dear, I am the last person to assume impropriety. Men sometimes form attachments quite on their own. Still, a persistent man can be, well, a trial, can he not?" Lucy said nothing, but her silence carried a weight of truth. Miss Marple filed the reaction away as she often did. People rarely confessed in words. The soul had its own form of speech. That afternoon, Constable Reeves arrived, full of fresh determination. "We've a lead, Miss Marple," he said proudly. "Mr. Cotterill came by the station, He says he's remembered something important. Claims he saw a stranger loitering by the lane the day before the murder. Big man, city sort, heavy boots. Matches Bristow's footprints. How fortunate, Miss Marple said pleasantly, as though remarking on the weather. Yes, and we've sent word to the station in Market Bexley to keep watch. If he shows his face again, we'll have him. Case nearly closed, if you ask me. Miss Marple merely smiled into her teacup. Convenient solutions had a way of arriving too quickly in murders like these. A stranger in boots. Oh, how comforting for a village that shuddered at the thought of pointing fingers inward. As evening fell, she made a quiet call on Mr. Cotterill, returning a library book she claimed she had found on his fence. He received her in his study, its shelves lined with meticulously arranged law volumes and the faint smell of cigar smoke. "Such a distressing business," he said, trying for somber dignity. "I only hope it's resolved soon." "I'm sure it will be," Miss Marple said mildly. Her eyes, however, wandered, not to the books, but to the fireplace rug, where the faintest trail of dried mud suggested someone had entered in outdoor boots and paused there. And there, in a wicker basket near the hearth, was a folded green wool scarf, the exact shade of the fibers she had noticed in the orchard bramble. "Such a lovely shade," she remarked, nodding to it. "Your wife's?" Cotterill hesitated, just for a breath. "Number it. It belongs to Miss Penberry. She left it here some days ago. She and her mother visited about a minor matter of her late father's accounts." "Ah, I see." Miss Marple's tone was the essence of benign curiosity, but inwardly her mind sharpened like a needle. Lucy's scarf, Lucy's nervousness, Lucy's presence by the orchard, and Cotterill. Why had he taken such a swift interest in a stranger suspect? Was it to divert attention from a very local, very human entanglement? That night, alone in her cottage, Miss Marple let the fire crackle softly as she pieced the human puzzle together. She could see it now. Not the final picture, but enough of the outline. Mr. Sims had met someone he knew in the orchard, someone he expected, or someone who followed him there. A confrontation had occurred, likely quiet and swift. Sims had been struck down, and the killer had fled in panic. A soft-soled impression, a green wool thread, and a nervous young woman's trembling hands whispered of a secret meeting gone wrong. But there was more to it. Lucy was frightened, yes, but guilt had many shades. Fear could come from witnessing as well as committing. And Miss Marple sensed a second hand in this matter. Someone older, colder, and far more calculating than Lucy Penberry. As the clock struck 10, she thought of the orchard under the moon, the trees heavy with fruit that would fall and rot if left uncollected. Human hearts, she reflected, were much the same. Left untended, they carried their secrets until they dropped them in some violent, irreversible way. And somewhere in St. Aldwyn's, someone was not sleeping well at all. The following day, a heavy mist rolled into St. Aldwyn's, muting the color of the fields and cloaking the narrow lanes in a damp, silvery haze. To most, it was a dreary morning, but to Miss Marple, such weather was useful. It gave people the excuse to stay indoors, to fidget with their worries, and sometimes to talk more than they ought. She had already noticed the subtle signs of unease creeping across the village. Mrs. Weatherby's curtains had twitched 3 times that morning as the postman passed. Reverend Prowse lingered unusually long outside the bakery, conversing in low tones with the miller's wife. In a small village, fear moved like smoke through keyholes. It seeped into the air, altering everyone's gait and glance. Miss Marple's first visit was to Mrs. Penberry's house, an elegant, slightly faded Georgian home with ivy curling along its facade. She had, of course, concocted a suitable excuse, a borrowed recipe book to return. But she truly wished to observe Lucy and her mother in their natural state. Mrs. Penberry herself opened the door, her posture stiff but her face carefully composed. She was a woman who ruled her home as if it were a small duchy, and every visitor, even a sweet-natured spinster like Miss Marple, was a subject to be managed. "Why, Miss Marple, how kind," she said, taking the book with a gracious smile. "Do come in for a moment, though I fear the house is a little out of sorts after recent events." The drawing-room was tidy to the point of severity, yet Lucy sat by the window with a bit of mending in her lap, her hands trembling ever so slightly. She rose at once. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said softly, "you've heard anything new?" "Only that Constable Reeves is very determined," Miss Marple said with gentle amusement. "He seems to believe your troubles will soon be over. What with a stranger in boots to blame." Mrs. Penberry's lips pressed into a line. "I should think so. This kind of scandal is intolerable. Imagine a murder in St. Aldwyn's. It reflects quite poorly on the village's reputation. Though I have told everyone Lucy is not to be troubled with impertinent questions." Lucy flinched almost imperceptibly at her mother's words. Miss Marple watched the girl's knuckles whiten on the sewing needle. Guilt, or fear of discovery, was gnawing at her from within. "I dare say you're right, dear," Miss Marple said, lowering herself into an armchair. "And yet, I always think it's the small things that matter most. For instance, a young man might have said something troubling, or left a note, or come to call. Little trifles, easily overlooked." Lucy's eyes darted to her mother, then back to the window. I don't know what you mean." Mrs. Penberry's gaze hardened. "Miss Marple, I am sure my daughter has nothing whatsoever to tell you." Miss Marple smiled, entirely unoffended. "But of course, I am only a foolish old woman who likes to notice things. And what I notice is that poor Lucy has not been herself since the tragedy. One can always tell when a young lady has been distressed by some unwelcome attention." Lucy's breath caught audibly. Mrs. Penberry's expression chilled further. "I think this conversation has gone quite far enough." Miss Marple rose to leave, murmuring polite thanks. But as she turned, she caught a small reflection in the hallway mirror. Lucy's eyes glistening with unshed tears, and the faintest nod, as if to say, "Yes, you understand." It was enough. By mid-afternoon, the mist had thickened. Miss Marple decided her next errand must take her past Mr. Cotterill's office in the village square. She found the solicitor hunched over his desk, spectacles low on his nose, as though buried in serious work. "Miss Marple," he said too cheerily, "what brings you out on such a dreary day?" "Oh, I was only on my way to fetch some lavender from Mrs. Bryce's garden. Thought I might stop and see how the inquiry progresses." Cotterill made a show of shrugging. "Oh, the police seemed confident it was some ruffian from outside. A tramp, most likely. Villages like ours are far too peaceful for such deeds." "Quite so," Miss Marple murmured. Her eyes wandered again to the green wool scarf, now missing from the basket by the hearth. In its place lay a neat pile of legal files. A careful man. Cotterill. Too careful. She tried a gentle prod. "I hear poor Lucy has been very upset." Cotterill hesitated, then offered a lawyer's polished sympathy. "Naturally, it was a terrible shock. But I am sure she will recover in time, especially once the culprit is found. Yes, Miss Marple said, leaning on her stick. The strange thing about village crimes, though, is that they rarely come from nowhere. They usually have roots like old apple trees, hidden underground, but deep and tangled. Cotterell's smile froze just slightly, and in that moment, Miss Marple was quite certain. This was a man with a secret. That evening, a new ripple of excitement ran through St. Aldwyn's. Word spread that the police had discovered Sims's missing watch and wallet in a ditch near the main road. Further proof of an outsider's robbery gone wrong. The villagers breathed easier, but Miss Marple felt the story settle uneasily in her bones. The items were too conveniently placed, too neat a conclusion. Criminals who struck in fear and passion rarely staged such evidence with such precision. It smelled of a diversion. Later, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to Tom Bristow, the farmhand who had first spotted the footprints. She found him mending a fence near the orchard. "Evening, Tom," she called. "You've been very observant lately. Quite the hero of the hour." Tom grinned sheepishly. "Well, I just told the constable what I saw. Those big boots and all. Reckon I done my duty." "And a fine duty it was," Miss Marple said, stepping closer. "Funny thing, though, I was out early the morning after, and I noticed some smaller impressions, soft ones, near the bramble by the gate. Did you happen to see those?" Tom frowned, rubbing his chin. "Can't say I did. But I weren't looking for little steps, was I? Big boots seemed the thing." "Indeed," she said lightly, though her mind tightened around the thread of truth. Everyone wanted to see the obvious, the simple, the tale that let them sleep. But murder in a small village was rarely simple. That night, St. Aldwyn's slept fitfully. The mist lingered, and a fox barked somewhere on the edge of the orchard. Miss Marple sat by her fire, the glow lighting the gentle creases of her face, and she thought of Lucy Penbury, the scarf, and Mr. Cotterell's careful lies. Two human hearts, entangled in fear. One young, one calculating. And somewhere between them, a man had died beneath the apple trees. It was time, she decided, to draw the truth a little closer, as one might coax a shy bird toward a waiting hand. The mist that had blanketed St. Aldwyn's for 2 days lifted by morning, revealing the village in a pale, washed light. Dew clung to the hedgerows like tiny beads of glass, and the orchard at Fallen Lord's seemed almost peaceful again, its gnarled branches stretching in quiet defiance of the horror they had recently hosted. To anyone else, it might have seemed as though the village had regained its calm. But Miss Marple knew better. She had spent the night thinking, knitting and unraveling a pale blue scarf that would never be finished. Her mind turning over every whisper of gossip, every flicker of expression she had observed since Mr. Sims's untimely death. Murder, in her experience, was rarely a clean act. It always left frayed edges, guilty glances, ill-timed words, or sudden silences. That morning, she paid a call to Mrs. Bryce, whose cottage overlooked the lane leading to Fallen Lord's. The old gardener was out in her apron, pruning her lavender. She was as wiry and sharp-eyed as any village matriarch. "Miss Marple, out bright and early, I see," Mrs. Bryce said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Well, I thought the air might do me good," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Besides, I like to see how the world looks after a storm of gossip." Mrs. Bryce chuckled. "Oh, the tongues have wagged right enough. Poor Lucy Penbury will have to take herself off to Bath if this keeps up. Half the village thinks she's heartbroken. The other half thinks she's hiding something." "Do they, indeed?" Miss Marple said, watching Mrs. Bryce snip a stalk with casual precision. "And which half are you in, dear?" Mrs. Bryce narrowed her eyes. "I don't like to speak ill of a young lady, but I've eyes. Lucy was seen meeting Mr. Sims more than once in that orchard. Her mother would have a fit if she knew, I shouldn't wonder. And that solicitor, Cotterill, he's been pacing about like a dog that's lost a bone." Miss Marple nodded, pleased that the threads were tangling just as she suspected. Cotterill's nervousness and Lucy's guilt-ridden glances pointed to some shared secret, one that had led to Sims lying cold beneath the apple trees. Later that afternoon, she wandered into the village square, where Constable Reeves was preening beside his bicycle, basking in the faint glow of his progress. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, puffing his chest. "I think we'll have this one wrapped up soon. That tramp I told you about, well, turns out he was spotted in Little Bidwell last week, trying to sell a silver pocket watch, same make as Sims's." "Really?" Miss Marple said with polite surprise. "And yet, I wonder why a tramp would risk sneaking into an orchard known to be on private land when there are easier pickings elsewhere." Reeves hesitated, frowning slightly. "Well, rogues aren't always logical, are they?" "No, indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "Though sometimes those who seem least logical are only following a plan that suits their own small world. Human nature rarely surprises me anymore, Constable." Reeves gave her a blank look, clearly unsure whether she was praising or patronizing him. Miss Marple simply smiled and walked on. That evening, she set the first threads of her quiet trap. It began, as many of her traps did, with an invitation that seemed harmless. A tea at her cottage for Lucy Penberry and Mr. Cotterill. She sent the notes in her neat, old-fashioned script, politely suggesting that she might share some observations about the case that might ease the young lady's mind. Both arrived punctually the next day. Lucy was pale, her eyes ringed with sleeplessness. Cotterill, by contrast, was meticulously groomed, but perspiring faintly at the temple, his polite smile stretched thin. Miss Marple poured the tea, chatting lightly about roses, knitting patterns, and the unseasonably damp weather. She was, to all appearances, the very picture of unthreatening domesticity. Then, as she handed Lucy a plate of biscuits, she said in a voice soft as warm milk, "Do you know, my dear, I once read a curious account of a young man who thought he could scare a lady into silence. He tried to frighten her, you see, thinking she'd never speak. But the trouble with fear is that it often makes people talk in the end." Lucy froze, the biscuit trembling in her fingers. Cotterill's spoon clinked too sharply against his saucer. Miss Marple continued, her eyes lowered as if she were speaking only to her knitting. "I thought of that story because of the scarf that went missing. A lovely green wool one, wasn't it? I dare say someone tried to use it, thinking it would be overlooked. But of course, a scarf leaves marks, and people remember the things they knit." Cotterill shifted in his chair. "Miss Marple," he said lightly, though his voice was tight, "I do hope you're not suggesting—" "Oh, heavens, no," Miss Marple said wide-eyed. "I'm far too silly to suggest such a thing. I only notice little things, like how certain people take very long walks near the orchard, and how others have been trembling with guilt ever since poor Mr. Sims was found." The room was silent, except for the soft tick of the mantel clock. Lucy set her biscuit down with a faint clatter. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Miss Marple smiled kindly. "I always think it's best to speak the truth before the truth finds its own way out. You see, lies are like wet leaves on a garden path, slippery and treacherous." For a moment, Lucy looked as though she might confess, but Cotterill intervened, his voice sharp. "Miss Marple, I think this conversation is most improper." "Come along, Lucy. We needn't listen to old wives' tales." He stood, helping the girl to her feet, but his hand trembled on her elbow. Miss Marple, unruffled, only nodded. "Yes, of course. Do take care on the path home. Mud can be so very revealing." That night, Miss Marple walked to the orchard. The moon was thin and silver, throwing long shadows between the apple trees. She stopped by the very spot where Sims had fallen and let her fingers brush the damp earth. It was not the earth that told her the next part of the story, but the faint crunch of a footstep nearby. She turned her head ever so slightly and caught a silhouette slipping through the mist. The stooped figure of Tom Bristow, carrying something long and wrapped in cloth. Miss Marple did not call out. She simply watched him disappear toward the hedgerow, her mind noting the pattern that had eluded the constable entirely. Tom had been quiet for days, and the simple men of villages often became pawns in more cunning hands. The trap was nearly set. Soon, the orchard itself would whisper the truth. The morning after her quiet vigil in the orchard, Miss Marple rose with the first light of dawn. She sat by the window of her little sitting room, a cup of tea steaming beside her knitting, and watched the village slowly stir to life. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the milk cart rattled down the lane, the driver humming a tune. To the casual observer, nothing was amiss in St. Aldwyn's. But to Miss Marple, the tension in the air was as palpable as a taut thread ready to snap. Tom Bristow's nocturnal wandering was the missing piece she'd been waiting for. By mid-morning, she had arranged to happen upon Constable Reeves outside the post office. He was wrestling with his bicycle chain, muttering under his breath. "Goodness, Constable," Miss Marple said gently. "You'll wear that poor chain to nothing if you tug so hard." Reeves straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "Oh, morning, Miss Marple. Blasted things slipped again. I was just off to check the orchard, make sure no one's tramping about where they shouldn't." "How very diligent of you," Miss Marple said. She lowered her voice. "I dare say you might want to look near the west hedge this time. There's often curious activity in that direction." Reeves frowned. "The west hedge? Why, what's—" "Only a suggestion, my dear," Miss Marple interrupted with a sweet smile. "I do so hate to see good effort go to waste." That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the orchard. The late October sun was weak, casting long fingers of shadow over the fallen apples. She moved slowly, almost aimlessly, as though admiring the mossy trunks and the last withered blossoms of the season. In truth, she was tracing the faint marks she'd glimpsed in the mud the previous night, prints that were too small for Tom's boots. She followed them to the west hedge. There, partly buried under a mat of damp leaves, was the end of a green woolen scarf, frayed and matted with dirt. Miss Marple bent with effort and plucked it free. Her mind worked as nimbly as her fingers used to. The scarf had vanished from Lucy Penberry's laundry 2 weeks ago. She had heard the girl lamenting it to Mrs. Bryce in the shop. And here it was, used for some hurried, clumsy purpose and then discarded in panic. It was time for the final test. That evening, Miss Marple invited Mr. Cotterill, Lucy Penberry, and Tom Bristow to tea again, this time under the polite pretense of helping her with some garden advice. She had also ensured that Constable Reeves was nearby, to hear a word about rabbit holes in the orchard, though she had given him strict instructions to wait until she sent a signal. The 3 guests arrived awkwardly. Lucy clung to Cotterill's arm, while Tom shuffled in with his cap in hand, avoiding everyone's eyes. Miss Marple, all gentle smiles and fluttering hands, served tea as though nothing were amiss. "Do sit, all of you," she said warmly. "I've had such a peculiar discovery today. Imagine, someone's been dropping knitting all through the orchard." She reached behind her chair and produced the green woolen scarf, its damp fringe unmistakable. Lucy let out a tiny gasp. Cotterill stiffened, his teacup rattling against the saucer. Tom's head jerked up, confusion clouding his features. "I found it near the west hedge," Miss Marple continued blithely. "Isn't it the very one you were missing, Lucy dear?" Lucy's lips trembled. I suppose it might be." "Oh, it is," Cotterill interrupted sharply, his voice too loud. "But that doesn't prove anything. Someone could have found it, or perhaps someone used it," Miss Marple said softly, to silence poor Mr. Sims when he threatened to reveal a certain arrangement. All eyes turned to her, but she did not look up from her knitting. Her needles clicked softly, a sound absurdly calm against the charged air. "You see," she went on, "Mr. Sims had a habit of sniffing out other people's business, and he found something this time that was rather more serious than idle gossip. A plan to sell part of the orchard land, perhaps, or some small inheritance matter that might have profited a certain young solicitor." Cotterill's face drained of color. Mr. Sims could be persuaded to keep quiet, for a price. But when he began to hint he might change his mind, fear took hold. And fear, in my experience, makes people clumsy. It makes them enlist others for help in hiding evidence, and it makes them leave behind little things, like scarves. Tom Bristow, who had been twisting his cap in his hands, finally burst out, "I didn't touch him. I only buried what Mr. Cotterill gave me. Said it was rubbish from the orchard." Lucy let out a small, choked sob. Cotterill's jaw tightened. "This is absurd. Pure village fancy." Miss Marple finally looked up, her blue eyes sharp as frost. "No, Mr. Cotterill, it is human nature. You tried to frighten Mr. Sims, and in the scuffle he fell. Perhaps you only meant to silence him for a moment, but he stopped breathing all the same. You sent poor Tom to hide the scarf and anything else incriminating, never realizing that the earth in an orchard keeps its secrets poorly." Cotterill pushed back his chair, knocking it over. "I don't have to listen to this." A firm voice interrupted him from the doorway. Constable Reeves, cheeks flushed with determination, stepped in. "I think you do, sir. And I think you'll be coming with me to answer some questions down at the station." Cotterill's face twisted with a mixture of anger and resignation. Lucy sank into her chair, covering her face with trembling hands. Miss Marple gave a small, sorrowful nod. "It is always a tragedy," she murmured, "when fear and greed take root in a quiet place. They grow faster than any weed in an orchard." Outside, the evening mist began to gather again over Fallen Lords. The orchard stood silent, its gnarled branches dark against the fading sky. And in the soft lamplight of her cottage, Miss Marple poured herself another cup of tea, reflecting, as she so often did, that murder in a village was rarely the work of monsters. It was the work of ordinary people, who believed for one desperate moment that a crime could be hidden under the fallen leaves. The arrest of Mr. Cotterill sent a tremor through the quiet lanes of St. Aldwyn's. By the next morning, it seemed that every villager with a window facing the square had stationed themselves behind their curtains, eager for a glimpse of the constable escorting the young solicitor to the train that would take him to the county station. Gossip rose like the church bell chimes, loud, repetitive, and impossible to ignore. At the bakery, Mrs. Gudgeon whispered to anyone who would listen that she had always thought him too smooth by half, while Mr. Keating, the butcher, declared he had lent Cotterill a knife once, and Ahoy's never quite trusted the way he handled it. In the post office, the topic was Lucy Penberry, whose tear-streaked face had been seen in the lane, though no one could agree whether she was more heartbroken for the man or ashamed of her role in his downfall. Miss Marple, however, did not involve herself in the chatter. She was seated quietly at her little table by the window, methodically finishing the pale blue scarf she had unraveled and re-knit throughout the investigation. Her needles clicked softly, and her expression was calm. For Miss Marple, the drama of a murder's aftermath was as predictable as the rising sun. Shock, curiosity, condemnation, and eventually, the comforting drift back to daily routine. That afternoon, Constable Reeves paid her a visit. His uniform was pressed, and he held his helmet under one arm, looking rather proud of himself. "Well, Miss Marple," he said, clearing his throat, "we've got Cotterill in custody. He made a full confession on the ride to the station. Said he only meant to frighten Sims, like you said. Gave the poor man a shake when he wouldn't keep quiet, and down he went, hit his head on the tree root. Claimed it was an accident, but..." He hesitated. "An accident's still a crime if you cover it up, isn't it?" "It is indeed," Miss Marple said softly. "But I dare say the jury will see the difference between malice and panic. It is always panic that leaves the trail for people like me to follow." Reeves nodded. "And that poor girl, Lucy. She told me Cotterill made her swear to keep silent. Said he'd handle everything, and she believed him. She's a frightened little bird, that one." "Fear and love make a dreadful pairing," Miss Marple said, setting down her knitting. "I do hope someone takes her away from the village for a while. She will need the air of another place to recover her spirits. Too many people here will remember her shame, even if they forgive her." Reeves shuffled, then leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping. "I've got to ask, Miss Marple, how did you know? I mean, before we had anything solid?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, I didn't know. Not at first. But I observed. I have always said that the smallest things betray us." Mr. Cotterill spoke too quickly when Lucy was accused in whispers. He feared discovery before anyone had actually accused him. And then there was Tom Bristow. A simple man, yes, but simple people rarely act on their own. Someone clever was behind him. Someone who thought the world would never notice if a scarf went missing, or if a tramp took the blame. Reeves grinned, admiration plain in his face. "Well, I can't say I'd have thought of all that. I suppose this village is safer for having you in it, Miss Marple." "Oh, I don't know about that," she said lightly. "The world is never entirely safe, Constable. People bring their weaknesses with them wherever they go. In a city, there are more of them to notice, and in a village, fewer, but far easier to see." By evening, the worst of the commotion had settled. Fallen Lords, the once peaceful orchard, was deserted again. Its grass still marked where the constables had tramped during the search. The trees, stripped of most of their fruit, stood like silent witnesses to human folly. Miss Marple took a slow walk there before supper, as was her habit after a case had closed in her mind. She paused near the gnarled tree where Mr. Sims had fallen, the spot now little more than a shadowed patch of earth. She thought of Mr. Sims, prying, meddlesome, and yet in his own way, harmless until he stumbled into the path of greed and fear. It was rarely the malicious who died in these quiet places, Miss Marple knew. It was often the inconvenient. As she stood in the orchard, she heard the faint clip of hooves on the distant lane and the soft calling of rooks overhead. The air was cool and scented faintly with earth and apples beginning to rot where they had fallen. She let the quiet seep into her bones that familiar sense of closure when justice, however imperfect, had been done. The next day, Miss Marple paid a visit to the vicarage, as she often did after a village tragedy. Reverend Harper met her at the door, his gentle face lined with concern. "Ah, Miss Marple. I was hoping you'd stop by. My wife says you've been the quiet hand behind this whole dreadful business." Miss Marple demurred with a small shake of her head. "I merely noticed what anyone might have seen if they looked carefully. Human nature is rather like a patchwork quilt, Reverend. You learn the patterns if you've been stitching long enough." The vicar sighed. "It's a sad business. I suppose we must pray for young Cotterill and for Lucy, and for poor Mr. Sims, of course." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "and perhaps for the village as well. It has been reminded once again that even the most peaceful orchard can hide the seeds of tragedy." Over the next week, the village began to settle back into its familiar rhythms. The gossip softened into quiet murmurs, and then into silences broken only by the occasional mention of that dreadful affair. Lucy Penberry went to stay with an aunt in Bath, and Tom Bristow returned to his chores, though he kept his head down and avoided the square. For her part, Miss Marple returned to her garden and her knitting. She planted a few bulbs for the spring and exchanged polite words with her neighbors, who now looked at her with a mix of gratitude and unease. She had, after all, lifted the veil from their small world and shown that murder was not the exclusive habit of cities and strangers. It could sprout here, among the apple trees and hedgerows, fertilized by jealousy and fear. One evening, as she sat with her tea and watched the sunset paint the orchard in shades of amber, she allowed herself a small private smile. She had solved another puzzle, restored another sliver of order to a disordered world. But she knew, as she always did, that human nature would provide another puzzle in time. And when it did, she would be there, an old lady with sharp eyes and a mind that never stopped observing in a village that mistook gentleness for harmlessness. The trial of Mr. Cotterill was held at the county assizes 3 weeks later, and though most of St. Aldwyn's could not attend in person, the story arrived back to the village in hourly whispers through letters, newspapers, and the occasional telephone call from some distant cousin with connections in the city. By then, the raw shock of the orchard's tragedy had softened into a sort of communal curiosity. It seemed everyone wanted to know whether the jury would believe the tale of a panicked accident or condemn the solicitor for cold-blooded murder. Miss Marple did not go to the trial. She never did in such cases. It was not that she lacked interest. Rather, she understood that her part in the affair was finished. Her role was to observe and to uncover, not to watch a young man's life unravel under the gavel's strike. Instead, she spent the morning in her rose garden, carefully pruning the last of the blooms before the true cold set in. She found the simple, repetitive work soothing. It was on the 3rd day of the trial that Constable Reeves came to her gate, hat in hand, cheeks flushed from his brisk walk up the lane. "Guilty of manslaughter," he said without preamble. They believed his story about the accident, but the concealment did him no favors. 5 years, with the possibility of earlier release for good behavior. I reckon it's fair, all things considered. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her eyes resting on the delicate curve of a fading pink rose. Yes, panic is not malice, and yet panic leads to harm all the same. He will have time enough to reflect, and Lucy Penberry, I hope, will have time enough to heal. Reeves hesitated, then asked, "Do you think she'll forgive him?" Miss Marple gave the faintest smile. Ah, young hearts are resilient. But forgiveness and trust are not the same thing, Constable. I dare say life will teach her that difference before too long. By the first week of November, the last leaves clung stubbornly to the orchard trees at Fallen Lords. The apples that had escaped the villagers' baskets and the crows' beaks were rotting sweetly into the grass, feeding next year's blossoms. The orchard felt quiet again, almost solemn, though Miss Marple thought she could still sense the echo of the summer's violence beneath its stillness. One mild afternoon, she took her customary walk to the far end of the orchard, leaning lightly on her walking stick. The air was damp with the scent of turned soil and wet leaves. She paused by the gnarled tree, whose roots had ended Mr. Sims's life, and let her gaze wander over the dappled ground. It was in these solitary moments that she often found her reflections most clear. Human nature, she mused, was very like this orchard. Outwardly ordered and serene, but with a wild, persistent life just beneath the surface. Hidden grudges, secret loves, small shames. All were seeds, waiting only for the right season to sprout. She thought of Mr. Sims, nosy and tiresome, but ultimately a man who had wanted little more than to belong somewhere and to know other people's business. His curiosity had been his undoing. She thought of Mr. Cotterill, polished and ambitious, who had imagined he could control events and people as neatly as his legal documents, only to discover that fear left very untidy footprints. And she thought of Lucy Penberry, who had learned in one dreadful summer that the warm blush of romance could curdle into a cold, suffocating secret. Miss Marple had often reflected that the small dramas of village life were mirrors of larger tragedies. In the city, scandal and betrayal hid behind brick walls and anonymous streets. In a place like St. Aldwyn's, everything was closer to the surface, like the shallow soil of an orchard, where a single rainstorm might wash away the earth and expose the twisting roots beneath. On Sunday, the village gathered at St. Aldwyn's Church for a quiet service of reflection. Reverend Harper, standing in the soft light of the stained glass windows, spoke gently about the season of endings and the hope of renewal. He did not name Mr. Sims or Mr. Cotterill, but every parishioner understood the sermon's meaning. Miss Marple sat in her usual pew, hands folded around her prayer book, and listened to the murmured hymns rise to the vaulted ceiling. Around her, neighbors shifted uncomfortably, still adjusting to the restored order of village life after the disruption of crime. It was always thus. The balance would return, but never quite the same as before. A small shadow would linger, a soft reminder that even the gentlest places were not immune to human frailty. After the service, the congregation spilled into the churchyard, exchanging quiet words. Mrs. Gudgeon, who had initially claimed she knew it was Cotterill all along, now spoke warmly of Lucy Penberry and her need for a fresh start. Mr. Keating the butcher was unusually subdued, offering to carry the vicar's basket of apples. The village was doing what villages always did, smoothing the rough edges of memory into a tolerable story. Miss Marple smiled inwardly as she walked home. She had lived long enough to know that these gentle narratives, soothing but incomplete, were necessary. People needed to believe that life in St. Aldwyn's was, at its core, safe and predictable. They needed the orchard to be only an orchard again, and not a place where fear and desperation had once taken root. That evening, Miss Marple settled by her window with her knitting and a cup of chamomile tea. The fire crackled softly, and outside, the last light of day faded into the soft blue of autumn dusk. She cast her eyes across the lane, where the distant silhouette of fallen lord's orchard rose against the twilight. Another story had ended, neatly enough, with names recorded in the newspapers and sentences handed down by the court. But she knew better than to think of it as truly finished. Life was a perpetual chain of small choices and quiet consequences. So long as people loved unwisely, envied foolishly, or feared discovery, there would always be another puzzle for an old woman to unravel. Miss Marple sipped her tea and returned to her knitting, the soft click of needles blending with the rhythm of the crackling fire. She thought of the world beyond her window. Not just St. Aldwyn's, but all the little villages scattered like pearls across the English countryside. Each one had its orchards, its gossip, its polite facades. And beneath every surface, human nature thrummed, constant and predictable. She had no need for fanfare or gratitude. Her satisfaction lay in knowing she had once again restored a fragile balance. Tomorrow would bring ordinary routines, garden work, letters to answer, perhaps a visit to the vicarage. Life would continue, quietly and unassumingly, in the village that had weathered yet another storm of its own making. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the orchard, next year's blossoms waited for spring. The rain had just ceased over St. Aldwyn's, leaving the village washed clean, the cobbled lanes glistening as though they had been freshly polished. The storm had swept through the night after Mr. Cotterill's quiet confession, and by morning, a pale golden light broke through the clouds. It was the sort of day that made even tragedy seem like part of the natural order of things. Miss Marple, dressed in her soft gray shawl, had been invited by Inspector Grayson to attend the final inquest at Fallen Lords. The old orchard, scene of so much gossip and speculation, now held a more somber purpose. The coroner and a handful of villagers gathered beneath the gnarled branches, where the grass was still flattened by the past week's comings and goings. Lucy Penberry, pale but composed, stood a little apart, her eyes fixed on the tree roots that had cradled Mr. Sims in death. Beside her, Mrs. Penberry dabbed discreetly at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, as though the memory of this violent disruption to their otherwise well-mannered lives had bruised her sense of propriety as much as her heart. Inspector Grayson turned to Miss Marple with a gesture of respect that was part genuine gratitude, part acknowledgement of the peculiar necessity of her presence. "Would you do us the honor, ma'am? I believe the village deserves the truth," spoken plainly. Miss Marple inclined her head. She had no desire for performance, yet she knew that clarity would close the circle of this unhappy tale. "The matter," she began softly, her voice carrying despite its gentleness, "is far simpler than it appeared to be. Mr. Sims was a man of curiosity, a trait which, in villages such as ours, can often be more dangerous than malice. He discovered Mr. Cotterill and Miss Lucy in a compromising situation within the orchard late one evening. Suspect Mr. Sims saw an opportunity for either profit or leverage. He may have intended to blackmail Mr. Cotterill, or at the very least, to make mischief of his knowledge." Lucy flushed and lowered her eyes, while Mrs. Penberry stiffened but said nothing. Mr. Cotterill, already under the strain of both ambition and secrecy, panicked when he realized Mr. Sims would not keep silent. Words were exchanged, perhaps threats. Mr. Sims, being older, may have underestimated the desperation of a younger man who saw his entire future crumbling in that instant. In the heat of fear, Mr. Cotterill shoved him, a single, thoughtless movement. Mr. Sims fell against the roots of the old apple tree, and the orchard became his grave. A shiver ran through the small assembly, though all had suspected this conclusion in their hearts. Miss Marple's gaze traveled over the bowed heads of the villagers. It was not premeditated evil, but human weakness that led to this tragedy. Pride and panic are poor companions. Mr. Cotterill then made the error that most men do when they have committed a grave mistake. He sought concealment rather than truth. And so the tangle grew, as such things always do, until it could no longer be hidden. Inspector Grayson cleared his throat, his voice gruff. The inquest will record this as death by unlawful act, with manslaughter to follow in the courts. Justice will take its course. Lucy gave a small, broken sob, and Miss Marple's hand, frail but steady, rested lightly on her arm. "My dear," she said, "forgiveness does not come in a day, but it will come if you let it. The important thing is to remember that even the gravest of mistakes may teach us, if we are willing to learn." That evening, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, the scent of wet earth and apple leaves lingering in her shawl. She settled by the fire, tea steaming beside her, and listened to the quiet of the house. The village would heal, she knew, though it would carry the soft bruise of this autumn for years to come. She thought of the orchard, peaceful now, the fallen apples returning to the soil, life cycling toward spring as it always did. Human lives were much the same. Missteps, secrets, fears, and small vanities. These were the roots from which greater tragedies often sprang. Yet just as nature reclaimed and renewed, so too did the world move on, folding each sorrow into the quiet fabric of village life. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, the firelight flickering on her needles. Another story was finished. Another lesson in human nature had been quietly, decisively learned. And somewhere beyond her window, the orchard slept under the last light of autumn, awaiting the gentle stirrings of another season,